For the first time, across the UK, we have exclusive access to the investigations of Britain's most talented detectives.
We'll spend years putting together all of these tiny pieces of evidence.
The most bizarre investigation I've been involved in.
And share the methods and evidence that can bring these criminals to book.
Handguns coming in from the United States.
He had the drugs.
That is a lot of money.
A real who did it.
This time, a gang human trafficking young women for sex work in Bristol.
I could see in the back of the car there was a girl wearing a dressing gown. My gut feeling was that something wasn't right.
A dangerous County Lines drug dealer is uncovered in Surrey.
The biggest problem we have is you just never know what's going to happen.
And the hunt for a vaccine fraudster in London.
The offender entered her premises. He put something sharp against her skin, took the money and left.
I joined the police 16 years ago. I've always been interested in the law. And then when I left university, the police was a natural choice. I started as a response officer in East Bristol. East Bristol contains the 3 on-street red light districts of Bristol, so that's where girls loiter on street corners and curb crawlers drive around the streets. So very quickly I was introduced to on-street prostitution. Then from that, I was introduced into human trafficking.
Estimates suggest the number of people trafficked into the UK has jumped tenfold in the last decade. But it's often hard for police to identify the victims, unless they get a lucky break.
I was in the centre of Bristol. A vehicle had hit one of the automatic number recognition cameras and it was shown as having no insurance. I responded by going to look for the vehicle. I could see in the back of the car there was a girl, very quiet, wearing a dressing gown. My gut feeling was that something wasn't right. I smelled a rat, basically.
Can you run this vehicle through ANPR, please? Just see where it's been. There's a female in the rear in a dressing gown and a suitcase. So just given what you told me, we're just trying to bottom out what's going on.
This is the first time in 13 years I have stopped a car with a female in a dressing gown in the back. My initial reaction was, she's a sex worker, but then I had to sort of try and determine whether she was doing that willingly or whether it was something a bit more sinister.
Okay, listen, you can just put the cigarettes out for me, guys?
What they told me was that they had gone to pick her up from the train station in Bath, but I was aware that the trains didn't come into Bath at that time of night from London. I had a girl in a dressing gown with a train ticket from London that was bought at lunchtime, and the train didn't arrive in the station at the time of night that we were at. Therefore, suspected that they'd been driving her around to essentially make her work.
Right, guys, at this moment in time, you're both under arrest on suspicion of human trafficking.
Police had a possible victim, but they needed evidence. They also needed to know how the traffickers operated and if there were more victims. Operation Beryllium was established to investigate. DC Dale Morgan was one of the lead officers.
Prostitution in the UK is legal. A girl working on her own for her own personal benefit that provides her own place to work is perfectly fine. It can't happen in a public place. Then it becomes illegal. So then you move off street into the brothels, and it's the person that controls the brothel that then commits the offence. While we don't mind prostitution in the UK, we don't want people being exploited. So we don't want women and girls being forced into prostitution or having their prostitution controlled. And you can't control prostitution for gain.
The Beryllium team had just 24 hours to build the case and unravel the financial trail before the 2 male suspects would be released without charge. But they were still to hear from the victim herself.
When I walked into the room and I saw her for the first time, She's in a dressing gown and there's a suitcase on the side, and she's actually just waking up from lying down on our sofa in our canteen. I thought she was far too young to be in that situation. She initially said she wanted help, she wanted support. She didn't want to be a sex worker anymore. She wanted to leave prostitution and return to Romania. And we said, yes, we can help you do that. We can take you away from this group. She then agreed to be interviewed. She was a little reluctant, so the interview didn't flow quite as a victim interview would normally play out. There were elements more like a suspect interview because she was very cagey about what had happened. We had to delve a little deeper into what happened in her life over the last few months and how she had arrived in the UK, ended up as a sex worker in Bristol. She hadn't been a prostitute before she arrived in Bristol, and now she didn't want to be a prostitute anymore.
The story the 19-year-old shared with officers was typical of women tricked by human traffickers.
She told us that she had known one of the suspects from Romania itself. She had gone to Germany, where she was working as a waitress, but she needed more money. She made contact with the male suspect online. When they started chatting, he said that she could come to the UK, be with him. He would be her boyfriend. He would look after her, and then that they would make money together. It's a process often termed a lover-boy approach. Come with me, I'll love you, I'll take care of you. She came in by a car, via a ferry, spent one night in a hotel. The next night she was in a brothel, and she was working as a prostitute.
The victim's recorded testimony was the first piece of evidence. But Operation Beryllium immediately had a problem.
After the interview, though, she had changed her mind. She didn't want any more police help. She said she just wanted to leave her own way, take her own path out of the UK.
In July 2020, a police stop in Bristol unearthed what appeared to be the human trafficking of a 19-year-old Romanian woman. Operation Beryllium was established to investigate.
Right, guys, at this moment in time, you're both under arrest on suspicion of human trafficking.
The police had a very small window to build a case and charge the suspects.
We've got 2 people in custody, and we can't hold them forever. We are going to have to release them within 24 hours, or something else has to happen. In my experience, if we release them on bail, 9 times out of 10, Romanian pimps are going to be on a ferry back into Europe and vanish within 48 hours. We wanted to charge them and remand them in custody. We had to pull together an investigation team quite quickly. We had the financial investigation unit looking at money laundering and asset recovery. We had an analyst within the Intel Development Hub looking at the phone work and trying to track where mobile phones have been.
With the clock ticking, Operation Beryllium made an incriminating discovery.
Very quickly, it was established that one of the men in the front had previous conviction in Romania for a like offence to human trafficking in sex workers.
The team quickly analysed the victim's police interview to understand how the exploitation worked and where it happened.
She would estimate about 6 men a day she would see. The average was £100 for a 1-hour in-call at the brothel, and our estimates from that, she was making about £4,000 a week. All the money made was given to the pimp.
The victim was working out of 2 addresses in Bristol.
Within the first 24 hours, we went to one of the brothels. It was clear there are 3 women there working together in one building. It is therefore a brothel.
With only a few hours before the police would have to release their suspects, the operation made another surprising discovery.
We found out that the boyfriend was married. We located the wife, and we very quickly established that this was a husband and wife controlling prostitution, controlling brothels, and the husband had a mistress. Our victim was one of the sex workers within the brothel. We then applied for an extension to keep the two men in custody up to 36 hours.
The 12-hour extension was granted.
That day, I worked from 8 o'clock in the morning to gone 10 o'clock at night, trying to gather all the material. Their accounts, I think they were just trying to come up with something to sound innocent. They had no knowledge of this prostitution. They were just giving a lift to a girl that asked them for a taxi ride, basically. They were providing a taxi ride.
I'll take your ID in a minute as well.
While the men were denying everything during their interview, text messages from potential clients were recovered by the police.
With that information, we could then see what had actually taken place earlier in the day.
Painstaking analysis of CCTV and their mobile phones revealed their exact movements before being stopped by police.
We could see the call from the person in the hotel to the pimp. He's asked for 2 girls overnight. The pimp then going and picking up the girls that were coming back on a train from London, taking them back to the brothel where they change, and then driving them out to the hotel where the punter is waiting. That showed the control that they had. The call would come into the pimp's telephone number. They would then get a sex worker and take the sex worker to the out call. That, in essence, is human trafficking. She then calls the pimps to come and pick her up because she's had an argument with her friend. They've picked her up and they're driving back to Bristol with the girl in the back of the car, which is when they're sighted.
The case for physical control was building, but Operation Beryllium still had to find evidence of financial gain.
We found suspicious activity happening on their accounts, £100 payments being sent in with various different phrases attached to it. It's just lots of money coming in constantly. £160,000 had gone through one of the female's accounts. There is usually a matriarch, a female in charge, that controls the money and controls the business. It's something odd that I've seen a number of times. The boys can almost be just the thugs. The muscle that does the trafficking takes the girls out in the car, takes them to the different clients.
With only 20 minutes before the police had to release their suspects, they finally had victim testimony. Proof the men were transporting girls for sex and making a financial gain. And the identities of 2 women running the brothels.
We then went to the CPS and asked them for charges for human trafficking, controlling prostitution, and money laundering. One of the pimps, the one that had a conviction in Romania for similar offences, pleaded guilty very early on, and the other suspects, having seen all the material that we were presenting, all 3 of them pleaded guilty.
The first female offender was jailed for 23 months, suspended for 2 years, for controlling prostitution for gain. The second female offender was given a 12-month community order for using or possessing criminal property. Maren Gregori was jailed for 21 months, and Alexandru Ditta was jailed for 2 years, both for controlling prostitution for gain.
The real win, though, is going to be the proceeds of crime and recovering their assets. And we were going to take back around £25,000. They've made a lot of money through controlling other people's prostitution. They've not had to do anything. They've not been having sex with 6 men a day to make all this money, to make thousands of pounds. I enjoy working on these cases. It is helping a victim that didn't want to be in that situation. She didn't want to be a prostitute anymore. After we met her, she wasn't. She returned to Romania, She's escaped that world.
County lines involves illegal drugs being transported from one area to another and sold via a specific mobile number, the county line phone. There are currently estimated to be over 600 organised county lines gangs operating in the UK. Knife violence is endemic to this type of drug crime. Every year, police forces nationwide coordinate 1 week of action to target the biggest county lines dealers in their region.
Just seen some dude come over to the car and leave again. A drug deal has taken place. Calm yourself down!
In 2021, that week fell in May, and our cameras were there.
I joined the police when I was about 25 years old. I done voluntary work within the police, working really on my weekends when I wasn't doing my normal job, which was fixing coffee machines. I'm 12, 13 years into my career as a police officer now, and I still wake up and enjoy coming into work every single day.
Surrey police face a constant battle with drug gangs from London who target their county.
Operation Viking was specifically set up by Surrey Police in order to have a dedicated unit to target the organised crime, which is county lines drug supply. During intensification week, we identified that there was an address that was being cuckooed. We figured out from phone work and intelligence that potentially some males from London had attended an address and taken it over. The term cuckooing is used where people take over a vulnerable person's house and they will then use that as a base in order to supply drugs. So they will prepare drugs, package drugs and sell drugs from the addresses. The whole team really got together in order to try and identify who the person in charge of the drugs line was.
The team brought together for the operation included Ed. Ed is a covert police officer whose identity remains protected.
I'm lucky enough that I've ended up on some proactive teams that focus on drug dealers and some nasty people that come down from London into the counties.
Sergeant Dan Heborn from Surrey's Divisional Support Unit was also on board.
Divisional Support Unit is myself and 10 officers, and we deal with all the warrants, the drugs warrants, the firearms warrants, all the high-risk arrests.
This is the Enforcer. This is a hooligan tool. We use this for breaking glass. We can also wedge doors open. This is a fairly new bit of kit, but we can use this for cutting doors. We can cut through metal with it.
The team planned a raid on an address they believed had been taken over by a drugs boss called Jaden Gregg. He was already known to DC O'Neill.
Jaden Gregg was a person who I'd previously dealt with as a police officer many years ago, probably 10 years previously. He was a dangerous character back then, and no doubt that things hadn't changed. He was a street robber when I was young in my career, and someone who would frequent on a daily basis on the streets of Croydon. And when I heard the name, you know, it didn't really knock me back too far to think that he would be the type of person who'd now take up this type of criminality.
Gregg was from London and had recently been released from prison after serving time for stabbing a man in the head. He was a highly dangerous individual. Surrey police were joined by Met Police who knew Gregg well.
There's some fast-time intel come in that there are 2 IC3 males in the address. They are supposedly in there with a load of drugs and the line phone.
This is the subject premises here. Monarch will do the main door. Guys, if we go double ram, Melv and Ollie, I'll take the Enforcer with the saw as a contingency. If we've got any real emergencies, we'll get a firearm pulled, then back to the van, we'll try and maintain cover. Cool, happy? Yeah. Right, we're pretty much good to go, mate.
I think the biggest problem we have is you just never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, we're in.
They're not here, they've gone.
It's really soul destroying because I don't think people realise how much work goes into executing warrants and getting to the point where you're ready to go in, you've got the resources available. When you turn up at an address and, you know, you've missed people by minutes.
It's quite common that if people have got something to hide and don't want us to be getting in quickly, they'll barricade it. So hopefully there's going to be some form of drugs and cash inside.
It was clear that the address was being used by a Class A county drug line to deal drugs from. Hidden in a lampshade was a large amount of heroin, 40 grams, which has a rough street value of around £4,000.
But with no Greg or members of his County Lines gang caught in the property, the police were still one step behind. Every year, police forces nationwide coordinate 1 week of intensive action to target the biggest County Lines dealers in their region. The Surrey Police Drug Unit led a raid on the suspected address of a notorious and violent dealer who had moved into the area from London.
Yeah, we're in.
But the property was empty and seemed short on leads.
It's all well and good kicking down a door and getting some drugs, but investigations aren't like that anymore. Drug dealers are getting smarter, investigations are getting harder. So once we're in the property, we like to slow it down. On this occasion, we're looking for bits that would link individuals to that address.
We found various mobile phones, and on a review of the mobile phones, we could see or identify a person who was sending messages which appeared to be directing people. So that would be the person who we'd call a line holder or the person in charge of the drugs line, who's referred to on that mobile phone as Slitty.
The police dug even deeper into the possible evidence at the scene.
During this search, a games console was located and found in the address to be plugged in, which is unusual and was clearly taken there by the persons using the address. We had the name Slitty as being a potential nickname or street name for a person involved. We were able to turn on this games console where we were able to see that the account logged in was also under the name Slitty. Also linked to this account was an email address.
That email address gave it a name, and I immediately identified Jaden Gregg.
Also uncovered were incriminating photos that placed the suspect in the property and showed large amounts of cash.
It's called candy. Candy from a baby, Brr.
With the help of the games console, evidence against Jaden Gregg was building. But his whereabouts was a mystery. The next day, Operation Viking and Met Police hit the streets of Croydon, where the suspect had links.
He's not been out of prison a long time for a serious assault where he stabbed people in the neck and stabbed people in the head. I have previous experience with this gentleman, and he was a bit lively back then.
The operation had teams searching different streets. And finally, one unit spot the suspect.
He's on the floor now! Get down on the floor! Get down on the floor! Get down on the floor! Get on the floor! Yeah!
Get on the floor now, you will be tasered. Get on the floor.
You're on your arrest, Jay.
Get on your knees.
Get on the floor.
Get on your knees now.
Step away. Step away. Come with me.
Get on your knees or you will be tasered.
Get his phone. Get his phone off of it.
Go and search. Search up. Search away. Search away.
Are you willing to provide the PIN code for your phone? You're not, no? Okay.
With Jaden Gregg in cuffs, the police search him, his associate, and the flat they had recently left for evidence to support drug dealing.
Like miniature scales there, innit? Phone.
That there. One. Two.
Okay, just before we step into the van.
You've grown up a lot since I've seen you last.
I've never seen you last.
I arrested you for a robbery in about 12 years ago.
On a bus.
Just got off a bus. Yeah.
He was arrested. Jaden Gregg was charged with supplying Class A drugs, intent to supply cannabis, and the possession of a knife. He was sentenced to a total of 5 years.
It was actually quite reminiscent to see Jaden for a second time when we'd arrested him. You know, he hadn't changed his ways, he was still up to criminality. He's a person, a very dangerous person, who will no longer be on the streets of Surrey to commit further crimes or exploit any further persons.
In Britain, during the COVID pandemic national lockdown, overall crime dropped. But cases of fraud didn't stop, as they adapted to the new reality. The huge sums of money in medicine mean the industry is a very natural target for fraud. The NHS falls prey to more than £1 billion of fraud every year. During lockdown, 6,000 cases of new types of COVID-related fraud and cybercrime resulted in £34.5 million of losses. City of London Police specialise in all types of fraud investigation.
I joined policing because I wanted to make a difference. I didn't want the normal 9 to 5. I wanted to go and do something that made an impact, made a difference. City of London Police is the lead force of fraud. We take on the most difficult and complex cases around the country. I've worked in lots of different fraud backgrounds. I've also worked in murder investigation, domestic violence, street gang crime.
With more people at home during the COVID pandemic and the streets easier to patrol by police, fraudsters adapted the way they operated.
When the pandemic struck, it came with a huge amount of different challenges for policing in general. We still couldn't let the criminals go unchallenged because very quickly in the pandemic there were COVID-related crimes emerging. Just goes to show criminals will make money out of anything.
One case that made national headlines during COVID was urgently handed to Detective Inspector Ives.
This was the first case that we had taken. Certainly in my past career dealing with street crime and violent crime, it was on those levels of cynicism and nastiness that this crime was committed. On the 30th of December, the victim answered her door. The offender was stood there with a lanyard, claiming to be NHS and claiming to be administering the vaccine. It was told to the victim that she needed to pay them just over £100 for the vaccine. Then the offender entered her premises. He put something sharp against her skin and then took the money and left. This was a standout case for the unit. The risk to the public was higher on this case than any other case we had at the time, and it was very, very clear that we had to deal with it quickly.
A wave of fake COVID jabs could have undermined public trust in the legitimate vaccination programme. City of London established Operation Frisia to stop the fraudster.
My role within the team was head of unit and head of operations. All of the day-to-day operational planning will come down to me. The actual work of kicking the doors down and getting the handcuffs on, we've got a really, really good and effective team that do that work. The tactical lead on the ground was Peter Gartland, a really experienced detective. He's super competent and he never fails.
I have a penchant, I suppose, for economic crime, because there's lots of powers that we have under the Proceeds of Crime Act to take money off villains, and quite frankly, that's where it really, really hurts them. On the 30th of December 2020, the victim, elderly in her years, mid-90s, received a knock at her front door. You know, we were at the height of a global pandemic. By virtue of her age, the victim is vulnerable. Bit of trickery at the door, so she let him in. She believed him. Took her into her lounge, asked her to roll her sleeve up where he placed a dart-like instrument against her skin. It's important to say that no vaccine was administered. The victim was asked to pay. She went upstairs, got £100 in cash. He told her that that wasn't enough, and so she found another £40 in cash. He then said that she would get reimbursed by the NHS, and then he left the premises.
But the vaccine fraudster didn't stop there. Within a week, he revisited his target.
On the 4th of January 2021, the mail turned up at her home address saying that she needed to pay him more money for the vaccine. He saw her as an easy target.
She'd realised then that this wasn't real, this was a fraud. It was a shocking crime to decide to commit. To her credit, she got him out of there. She told him where to go.
The victim contacted the police.
And it was because of that quick action that the police got on the hunt. What had been alleged was something that we couldn't allow to happen again, even for a single day. This wasn't an easy crime to fall for. At that time, elderly people above a certain age were waiting for that call.
Recent data suggests an elderly person falls victim to fraud every 40 seconds in the UK.
The elderly generation are very trusting of people. They prey on that. You know, that provides the mechanism for their offending.
It was difficult not to feel angry, to put someone's life at risk for just over £100.
They don't just target one individual. They might do half a dozen houses over a day or two period.
They would potentially be spreading the virus. That's why we targeted resource and we stopped our other work for a period of time. I had to convince the organisation that I could solve this in 7 days with the team. It was a challenge.
Make no mistake, this was an old school manhunt.
No matter how determined officers were, they had an immediate problem.
We had very little to go on.
There was one piece of rather grainy CCTV image to work from.
The fact that we had an image didn't tell us who it was. He's one of hundreds of thousands of people in and around the London area.
It was clearly a community-based crime, and so the answer was to lay in that community.
Old-fashioned police work, knocking on doors, basically. Were you at home? Did you see anything? Was anything unusual? Anybody out of the ordinary in the street? It's quite a close community in that part of the world, and neighbours look out for each other, which is something that doesn't happen everywhere. It is not the public's job to do the police's work, but we can't, with cases like this, necessarily identify a suspect without the public's help. The only way we were going to get a name for that person was to go loud on press, was to invite the public. Do you know who this person is? Let us know. Let us have it. We'll work through it.
Operation Frisia resorted to the age-old tactic of a public appeal.
The case was so shocking, someone was likely to want to tell us who he was.
An appeal can generate lots of leads, but sometimes that's a problem in itself.
The press appeal was wildly successful and elicited a very large number of responses. That's what you want to see. When you have a large volume of information incoming like that, there is always a concern that the right information will get lost. If the wrong suspect was filtered out, then we would have lost our man.
During the COVID pandemic, crime didn't stop. In January 2021, police were contacted by a 96-year-old female who was the victim of a vaccine fraud.
the offender entered her premises. He put something sharp against her skin and then took the money and left.
Police used grainy CCTV images in a public appeal to identify the suspect.
The fact that we had an image didn't tell us who it was. He's one of hundreds of thousands of people in and around the London area. The only way we were going to get a name for that person was to go loud on press.
Operation Frisia gave themselves a week to find the fraudster.
Every day that we hadn't identified this person was a day that they could be knocking on other doors and putting lives at risk. It was urgency, but it was a real professionally calm but fast-paced working environment.
There were a lot of officers working on this job. We were following up leads, we were conducting bank inquiries, CCTV inquiries. We were doing all sorts of different things to try and link people to the area. CCTV is an investigator's dream and an investigator's nightmare. It can give us a facial image of a suspect. It can show us how an incident has unfolded. But to sit and go through that footage is hours. You can fast forward a little bit, but the danger of fast forwarding is you miss stuff.
3 days into Operation Frisia, and the pressure was immense.
So every name that we got followed up on. Do these individuals have any previous convictions? Have we got a custody image? Narrowed that down really to one individual who roughly matched that on the CCTV.
We would not have got evidence without the knocking on doors.
We had got a name both from the public and as a result of inquiries with CCTV.
Quality can be differing, but when you've got really distinctive things like haircut and clothing, and you can tie down an individual to a location, then it can be case solving.
The suspect's name was David Chambers. He had previous convictions, so the police had an address for him.
That sealed the deal. There he was. That's who we needed. We just had to find him. We were following every lead that came in, following up CCTV inquiries, trawl hours and hours and hours of footage. That would in turn identify a suspect and provide us just that little snippet that we needed to tie in with other evidence that we had. And we were very fortunate that we established that the suspect may have gone to visit a pharmacy. So we attended that location. We struck lucky with the pharmacy. On the CCTV was our man. We had him on CCTV in the area on the 30th, 45 minutes an hour, something of that order after that first offence, wearing the clothing as described by the victim. It's too coincidental for that not to have then been a person of interest. Although we knew who we were now looking for, finding him was a very different thing.
There was no time wasted. We had immediately gone to David Chambers' address.
He wasn't there. Large family group there, told us that they hadn't seen him, didn't know where he was.
The side effect of a press appeal is that the suspect knows you're after them. And at that point, this individual tried to cut all ties with any traceable addresses or people. He had gone on the run.
This was a major setback.
You go door to door until you find him. It's police work, isn't it?
With the suspect on the run, officers began visiting his previously known haunts.
At this point, I didn't have that long left with my huge resource before I had to be redeployed again. A modern manhunt involved lots of old-fashioned policing, knocking on doors, knocking on acquaintances, families' doors, putting professional pressure on that suspect to know that the police are out there and not giving up. This situation couldn't run on for 2, 3, 4 weeks. So we brought in the Metropolitan Police, who have a specialist dedicated manhunt team. I was confident that we would make that 7 days. Doesn't mean there wasn't pressure, though. There really was.
He knew he was wanted. Friends, family, associates must have been telling him, police are looking for you. And he went to ground. And we spent the next little while really trying to find him. Every little tangible address we could possibly link to him was called on. Late Thursday night, 11:30, midnight, we found him at an address in Surrey.
An address that wasn't previously recorded on any of his records. The net closed with the City Police team, with Pete, with local units from Surrey Police and the Metropolitan Police, all converging on this one address at the same time. I was sat literally next to the radio, definitely nervous.
standing in front of him, he was the person on the footage. He absolutely matched the description.
There was definite pride at that point in the whole team that we'd caught him.
The game was over for him. He looked like a broken man. He was actually very polite, very courteous, meek, mild, yes sir, no sir, like butter wouldn't melt. It was clearly him.
That first stage of getting that danger off the streets was complete.
We arrested him, brought him back to Bishopsgate custody, where we conducted interviews with him.
Operation Frisia were ready to put their evidence in front of Chambers.
He gave a no comment in that interview.
Didn't want to talk. Didn't have the decency to explain what he'd done. Following morning, he was subjected to a further interview. He didn't answer any questions then either. Frustrating, but I was satisfied we had enough to charge him. I wanted him to stay in custody. We couldn't release him, we couldn't bail him. It had been a nightmare to find him, quite honestly. We needed to keep him in custody for the public's safety and to prevent him from disappearing. He went before a magistrate who also saw fit to keep him in custody.
David Chambers was charged with 2 counts of fraud and 1 of common assault. After a 7-month wait in custody, he finally came before the courts and was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison.
David Chambers changed his plea and pled guilty.
This just gives you a bit of a measure of the man, really. We've got a vulnerable victim. He knows the victim's vulnerable. He knows how old she is. Yet he puts her through further stress, further anxiety. He should have just pleaded from the off.
We knew we had the right person, but to have that confirmed and cemented in place with a guilty plea, it is a big moment for the team.
He was sentenced to 3.5 years custody.
And alongside that was a 7-year criminal behaviour order. The criminal behaviour order will mean that the defendant can't do door-to-door sales.
Cold calling people's addresses, either in person or via telephone. He can't leaflet drop, solicit for work, and unless it's an emergency, he cannot just go and bang on somebody's door.
If they do, they're liable for arrest immediately. A great result for the team, for the victim, and for the police in general.
All that hard work, all that effort, all of those hours, on behalf of the victim, it provided a little bit of closure.
If you wanted to stay on the case with the detectives covering the most complex cases in the country, don't forget that Special Ops Crime Squad UK continues next Sunday at 7. And if you missed any of the previous shows, catch up now on UK TV Play. While next up is QIXL.
When hardened criminals repeatedly evade justice, elite police units come together to crack these toughest cases.
All police officers!
My role is investigating serious and organised crime.
We are a covert investigative team.
For the first time across the UK, we have exclusive access to the investigations of Britain's most talented detectives.
We'll spend years putting together all of these tiny pieces of evidence.
The most bizarre investigation I've been involved in.
And share the methods and evidence that can bring these criminals to book.
Handguns coming in from the United States.
He had the drugs.
That is a lot of money.
A real who did it.
This time, in Gloucestershire, a dangerous gang dealing drugs and guns from other counties.
They found a shotgun in the boot.
So our concern then is what other firearms could he have access to?
A fraudster stealing hundreds of thousands while living the high life.
Just in Harrods, man. Nice bread, son.
Viva valued these claims that they paid out in the region of about £200,000, and they were starting to realise that this was one big fraud.
And a heartless group buying and selling Britain's wild birds for profit.
I was receiving a phone call from one of my colleagues that there is an aviary that's massive, that is chock-a-block full of wild captured goldfinches.
I thoroughly enjoy investigative work. It's organised criminality that I've been involved in now for probably the last 10 to 12 years. It's that serious organised crime, the gang networks, it's that world.
In Gloucestershire between 2020 and 2021, there were over 1,600 drugs offences recorded, more than 4 a day.
There's organised criminals here in Gloucestershire in the same as any other town or county, maybe not at the same level as the likes of London and Manchester, but we still have proper serious criminals.
One criminal whose name kept cropping up more and more was local drug dealer Lee Fisher.
He's lived in Dursley all his life. Our view at that time from a drugs intelligence perspective was that he was involved with his brothers, with his family, and with people he'd grown up with. It was a very sort of close-knit community. Dursley is a very small town. Yes, I'd heard of Lee Fisher. My view originally was big fish, little pond. The intelligence came in was saying that Lee Fisher was the biggest drug dealer in the area. Lee Fisher was involved in violent feuds. Lee Fisher was involved in the supply and the movement of firearms. It was then that we suddenly realised that actually the criminality here is higher than perhaps we thought was the case before.
Concerned about the reports of the local drug dealer expanding his empire and using more menacing tactics, Chief Inspector Fletcher decided to set up a dedicated team to tackle the problem.
I'm the leader of the team. It's just my responsibility really to bring those people together and highlight their specialisms and bring the best out of everybody. And then I have an evidential team led by Matt.
Whether you're part of the surveillance team or part of the investigation team, there's a real mix. Sometimes you just need patience because we work to the timetable that the criminals set.
Dan is probably the most tenacious investigator that I've known in my 24 years in the job.
I've built up quite a good understanding of how drug supply works within our country and the technicalities, if you like, around police investigations in terms of that type of crime.
In February 2018, they launched Operation Glamorgan.
It's really important to try to get as much information as you can about a person that's under investigation. Really want to kind of live their life with them so you know where they're going, you know where they've been, and that's what we set out to achieve with the surveillance.
And watching the gang's movements soon paid off.
And this is when we first saw his links to Liverpool. It was, quite clear that Lee Fisher was tied into what are some quite serious criminals in the Merseyside area. And we started looking at his phones. We suspect something is happening because of all the activity that's gone on before, all the communications that have occurred, but we're not quite sure what.
One of his associates that he was linked to, their vehicle began travelling to Liverpool, and so a surveillance team was scrambled to work behind that car and see what happened when that vehicle travelled to Liverpool.
We're utilising Merseyside because we're going into areas of Liverpool that are sort of deemed to be quite a hotspot for policing activity.
And it's a very challenging time for the surveillance team because they're working behind people they don't know that well. We got a lot of help from Merseyside police as our team arrived into Liverpool.
But although the team identified other gang members, one man was nowhere to be seen.
We were aware that Lee Fisher was flying out of the country to Belfast. It's a relatively common sort of method that some criminals look to do is when they're carrying out criminality. And ultimately, they may change the way they're operating or they may leave the country.
Whilst their main target was out of reach, for now, the police team doubled down on the rest of the gang.
They were able to see an interaction with another person. Something was placed into the back of the car, but we weren't able to say what that was at the time.
Followed them as they've gone back out of the city, and it's obvious now they're coming back to Gloucestershire. So I've asked Merseyside police to stop the car, suspecting that there's something in the boot of that vehicle, and I want to know what it is.
They eventually found a shotgun in the boot, and then the occupants of the car were arrested and taken into custody in Liverpool.
Our concern then is, well, what else can he get, and what other firearms could he have access to if he wanted to through his contacts in Liverpool?
When the team examined the guns seized from the boot, it became clear the gang were a bigger threat than they thought. But disappointingly, they found no evidence of drug dealing and the gun courier didn't talk.
It's going to be easy to discharge, easy to get ammunition for, and it's something that can cause some serious injury or death.
If they're asking for money or their debt paid back and they're pointing that at you, you're going to pay, aren't you?
They may have found a gun, but they were still struggling to connect Lee Fisher with any crime.
When his associate was arrested and his phone was seized, there was quite a lot of messages between him and Lee Fisher, where Lee was asking for things to be speeded up because he needed the thing back in Gloucestershire. So we started to bank some really nice evidence early on, but we still needed to continue the investigation to see what other criminality Lee Fisher was engaged in.
The team continued to watch the gang members' every move.
On the 5th of June, surveillance officers captured what turned out to be an important meeting.
One of the people we'd identified working for Fisher was a chap called Stephen West, and we believed that he was a drugs courier or a drug supplier working on behalf of Lee Fisher.
Stephen West was a trusted member of the gang, and police had followed him to a fast food restaurant where they believed he was meeting with a courier from another organised crime group.
We saw the courier drive in, Stephen West walk across the car park, meet up with the courier, jump into the car and then come back out again, and there's a potential exchange of bags that has occurred, identifying potentially a route of some of those drugs coming into Fisher's enterprise.
The team thought they had evidence of the drugs route, but with no drugs or sign of the main man Lee Fisher, they couldn't risk going in too soon.
I don't have the resources to be able to strike out there and then actually to arrest people, and also I need to look at the bigger picture.
It was a little bit deflating, obviously. It's not what we wanted.
When Gloucestershire police noticed an escalation in drug dealing in their area, they set up Operation Glamorgan. Their target was a violent gang led by local criminal Lee Fisher.
Intelligence came in saying that Lee Fisher was the biggest drug dealer in the area and tied into what are some quite serious criminals.
Although they had evidence against one of the gang members, Stephen West, they were still struggling to pin anything on the main man. But they were getting close.
There's always a risk whenever you execute a warrant that it may tip the hand to the person you're looking at. They may change the way they're operating, or they may leave the country, etc., or leave the county. But it's a risk that you have to balance up and understand. And if you're being frustrated, then sometimes that's what you need to do.
And they decided to take a risk after watching an address in town.
We saw Lee Fisher go there on a number of occasions. We saw Stephen West go there on certain key dates when he then went on to meet one of the suppliers.
I arranged my intel team to obtain a warrant for that address, and on the 22nd of June we go to that address and execute that warrant.
But unfortunately, there wasn't the large amount of drugs that we were anticipating might be present.
We also identify a number of weapons that are stored there that aren't criminal offences per se, but it does give us the penchant for what people are carrying around with them.
However, we did seize a number of quite important items such as scales, wrappings and things that show that drugs have been prepared there, and also importantly we seized 1 or 2 key mobile phones. But over the next couple of weeks, once the phones seized were downloaded and we started to understand what had taken place there, we knew that it was an important part of the investigation and it would give us some good information about Lee Fisher particularly, and some of the messages on the phones about how he was able to source drugs and sell it to others.
They stepped up surveillance on the gang, and in particular Lee's brother, Daniel Fisher.
On the 2nd of July, officers observed Daniel Fisher travelling to an address in Gloucester Road in Stonehouse, which is where Stephen West lived.
They moved in and out of the house on a number of occasions. It's my belief that he's potentially picked up items from that address. I give the instruction to say that I want Danny Fisher detained and searched, and he stopped on the street outside his car and he's found to be in possession of a quantity of drugs and mobile phones. So he gets arrested, and at the same time, because we've arrested Danny Fisher, I give the instruction as well that we're going to go in and execute the warrant that we've already got for Stephen West's home.
Sadly, the Probably the best thing we found there was 2 empty kilogram block wrappings. So cocaine's packaged in a very particular way, and it's quite obvious what they were. But again, we were slightly frustrated that the timing wasn't quite right and we hadn't seized the drugs.
At first sight, the raid again didn't seem to have surfaced much. But what they thought was an innocuous piece of paper turned out to be a key breakthrough, a dealer's list.
Really importantly, some dealer lists were seized, which basically was their written record of all the people they'd been interacting with over the previous months.
That was gold dust. It was an absolutely brilliant piece of evidence. Look at the figures so that we could understand the money that was coming through. Once you understand the money, you then understand the amount of drugs. What we were able to do was look at those people that we suspected were involved in the group, match up their initials, because it wasn't that hard. Many of the initials, well, all of them, I think, matched the people that we were looking at. I can't really put into words how important that piece of paper was in terms of the investigation.
The police now had strong evidence to implicate the lower members of the gang, but not enough on the boss, Lee Fisher, who had become evasive.
He left Gloucestershire because at that point in time he felt that the police activity had got too much, so he needed to start to distance himself. Mobile phones are great, you don't have to be in the area to be involved in what's going on. You can go and live somewhere else and still orchestrate.
But only 5 weeks later, Lee resurfaced. And ironically, it looked like the police's best chance of implicating him would be through his dealings with a different gang.
On the 16th of August, Lee Fisher had been shown through all these events to be communicating with someone who was quite a significant drug supplier in Gloucester.
They did everything they could to prevent us from seeing the meeting.
This is a meeting of minds. This is a meeting of the heads of the 2 OCGs.
There was one piece of the evidence jigsaw that remained to be filled.
On paper, we had quite a strong case, but where we were lacking it was a significant seizure of drugs. As the surveillance continued on the 16th of September, a further important event took place where a number of people were seen to come together in a small village pub in one of the villages on the outskirts of between Stroud and Dursley. And Lee Fisher was seen to meet with somebody called Mark Bainbridge, who was potentially a customer of his. One of the perks of the job is to go and sit in the pub and try and listen to the conversation or understand what they're doing. I could see phone calls being made by the key people in terms, and then they went outside for a meeting. Lee Fisher was calling the head of this organised crime group and vouching for Mark Bainbridge as a customer and setting up a meeting between Mark Bainbridge and one of the head of this organised crime group's suppliers later on that day.
The surveillance team continued to watch Mark Bainbridge as he travelled to a small village called Leonard Stanley,
which we knew from experience was a meeting place where the people supplying it quite like to meet customers to supply drugs.
So again, we are able to capture the exchange that takes place.
One of the really great things for me that we saw at that point was that the footage showed that Mark Bainbridge had a big lump of something white in his pocket, basically. You could see it. Tends to be on a drug deal, you'll see people come in nice and slow and they'll have a look around, you know, they make sure the coast's clear, and then when they get the stuff, they're like, and they're off.
I've made a decision that we're going to look to put an intervention in on this point.
And then a short time later, that car was halted by uniformed colleagues and he was found to have a quarter kilo of drugs in his possession. We knew that was going to be the final piece of the puzzle to really strengthen the case. We had so many pages and pages of call data and surveillance evidence that we just needed something to prove to a court exactly what they were talking about or phoning each other about or what those meetings are about.
This particular day was really important because it showed the quantity of the drugs that Matthew Cornwall was supplying, and it also showed the quantity of the drugs that were going into the Lee Fisher organisation.
Lee was arrested in Dursley, just not far from his home address, and he was brought into custody for while searches took place at a lot of other addresses. So in total, 13 people were arrested and charged.
Stephen West pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply cocaine and was sentenced to 6 years and 9 months. Daniel Fisher was charged with conspiracy to supply cocaine and sentenced to 5 years. Mark Bainbridge received a sentence of 4 years and 4 months. The gang boss, Lee Fisher, was charged with 2 counts of conspiracy to supply cocaine and sentenced to 6 years and 9 months in prison.
It felt fantastic that, you know, we've got him. He's been prosecuted and he's now at Her Majesty's pleasure.
Crash for cash is a scam which sees fraudsters invent or deliberately cause road traffic collisions. It costs £336 million every year and increases the cost of all drivers' premiums. This type of fraud is big business, and in 2018, there were 58,000 fake claims involving cars, worth over £605 million.
I joined police at the age of 16, straight out of school. I was a police cadet, and then joined the regulars at 18. I worked within the Insurance Fraud Enforcement Department with the City of London Police as a detective sergeant running an investigations team dealing with insurance fraud. The sense of it being a victimless crime isn't the case, actually. There's a lot of victims behind fraud, and also it's a very hard crime to detect because people can hide behind electronic devices, mobile phones, computers, that type of thing.
Sergeant Hussey's unit is responsible for 580 convictions at court, resulting in over 300 years of prison time.
We deal with all types of different insurance frauds, whether that's crash for cash, doctors, dodgy solicitors, to basic claims fraud.
When the unit received a tip-off from the Ministry of Justice about a crash for cash scam worth £200,000, they decided to set up Operation Sabic to find out who was behind it.
A solicitor had reported fraud in that they'd been receiving a number of referrals that had come through that were fictitious road traffic collisions, and highlighting to us that this was a fraud and needed investigating.
But when the team investigated further, they found that not only were the fraudsters making money on false referrals, they were making staggering sums from the insurance companies by taking out policies in fake names and making false claims for crashes that never happened.
We were provided with the details of one particular claim, and our internal checks then established a link to over 60 policies and over 40 claims.
Aviva valued these claims that they paid out in the region of about £200,000, and they were starting to realise that this was one big fraud.
In this scam, what the suspects were doing was setting up fraudulent bank accounts with either stolen or entirely fictitious IDs. They would then use those to apply for a policy with Aviva. Very shortly after taking out the policy, we would then receive a phone call notifying us of a claim from one of the suspects pretending to be the policy holder, our customer, saying that they'd caused an accident. We would then be contacted by the third party, and that would either be one of the other suspects or even just the same suspect pretending to be somebody else, and they would say that they were injured and bring a bodily injury claim, personal injury claim.
And to support that, they would use photographs of vehicles, which were generally just found on the internet, really, and just doctored.
The details of that vehicle would match the details of the vehicle for the policy, and so we would always then pay a claim in good faith.
Both teams had their work cut out to try and find out who was behind the fraudulent claims.
We looked at money flows, looked at telephone numbers, emails, that type of thing, and where this was all registered to. And then we come up with a common suspect, someone that we'd previously dealt with.
The Insurance Fraud Enforcement Department of the City of London Police established Operation Sabic to dismantle a case worth over £200,000.
We've established a link to over 60 policies and over 40 claims. 40 is a big number of claims. It's the second largest scam that we've ever had to deal with. So this was a very significant scam.
We realised that the main suspect in this case was using some of the same information from the previous crimes. We couldn't believe what was going on, just the arrogance, really, of that. That helped us because we could use some of the evidence from the previous case on our new case.
The man they had in mind had been sent to jail in 2013 for a similar scam, using scrapped cars to take bogus payouts from insurers.
We knew that they were a professional boxer, portrayed themselves to be a real pillar within their local community in providing sort of boxing services. You know, we knew that we were dealing with someone that is quite skilled at controlled violence. So, you know, this was a big factor when we're planning this operation to make sure we get it right.
And instead of keeping a low profile, the convicted fraudster was featured boxing on the television. He also ran his own YouTube channel with over 40 self-promoting videos encouraging young people to be like him.
I want my young generation in Afghanistan to be better than me and good as me, you know.
Using his past to evoke empathy and support.
Because it was a war back in Afghanistan and Kabul, so my dad decided to send me to England for a better life. I probably was about 11 years old.
The main suspect of the scam was spending his money on extravagant holidays, on high fashion, on extremely expensive motor vehicles, living well beyond his apparent means.
So our main subjects led a very lavish lifestyle. They loved their fast cars, they liked their holidays. In effect, they owned a property abroad. So this criminality was basically funding their lavish lifestyle.
Ladies and gents, the mighty RX-7 is about to go out.
And one of the ostentatious vehicles he flaunted online was a custom-built, bright pink sports car.
You know, Justin Harrods, man, nice race, so let's see what's going on.
There was quite a funny photograph that was recovered in the first investigation where there's a picture of our subject just surrounded with his dog and £50 notes.
The suspect, Hamid Siddiqui, had no way to account for his playboy lifestyle, and he seemed to think he was untouchable.
We go hard or we go home. Let's go, baby. If anyone comes my way, I'm gonna knock him out. Boom.
The team had nowhere near enough evidence to go to court. Their only option was to attempt a search of properties connected with Hamid.
We'd conducted 2 searches, which was negative, so we was quite unhappy. We then come across some other information as to another address where he potentially would be, which was a shop premises in northwest London. It was a little bit strange, really, because all the other premises were, you know, greengrocers, newsagents, bakeries, cafes, that type of thing. And there was this one premises that had blackened out windows, like mirrored glass. We kept knocking and knocking and still no reply. There was a slight little tear in the mirrored glass. So as we were looking through the glass, we saw our main subject hiding behind the desk. And eventually, I think he weighed up his options and realised actually the game was up, and he came and opened the front door. At the rear of the shop was like living accommodation, just a single bed and a small kitchen. But within that area we found things like bank cards in different people's names, we found mobile phones, stolen identities, and it turned out that a lot of this information was linked to our case.
Incredibly, we found this main suspect to have a conservative estimate of over 100 aliases. Practically, that would mean that he would have to have fake ID or stolen IDs, different telephone numbers or contact numbers or a number of them, and understand which one was related to which alias.
The team had uncovered an incredibly complex web of lies, but not the critical evidence they needed. And it looked like it had been destroyed.
We've got special equipment that can recover deleted data, for instance, and from that we realised quite quickly there was evidence on there to suggest that he was making up claims with Aviva, instructing other people on what to say.
It was the breakthrough the team needed. And in another surprising twist, they discovered Hamid had recruited his own girlfriend into the crime.
From listening to conversations on the call recordings and listening to the main subject's partner, we knew that it was her. So we then started to build a case around her, looking at obviously her involvement, and we recovered mobile phones that when downloaded we realised that actually she knew exactly what was going on, as she was receiving instructions from her partner as to what to say, what to do in relation to these claims.
After an exhaustive year of collating and gathering evidence, the team had cracked the case. At court, the defendants pleaded guilty. Siddiqui's 32-year-old girlfriend received an 11-month suspended sentence. For masterminding such an elaborate scam, Hamid Siddiqui himself was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The police are now looking to recover funds that were illegally obtained under the Proceeds of Crime Act.
The suspect was extremely overconfident in his criminal ability. That led to greed, and ultimately that led to his downfall.
Each year, the illegal sale of endangered species is worth around £15 billion globally. A recent study revealed that in the past 50 years, Britain has lost 38 million birds from its skies, mainly due to intensive farming methods. Illegal traders in the UK sell wild birds for between £50 and £120, depending on their colouring and birdsong.
I've got nearly 25 years of policing experience. My current role is to lead a very wide, diverse range of operational teams. The Wildlife Crime Unit, which is a unit of specialist, highly trained detectives with a research analytical capability. For the last 12 months, we have investigated just under 500 wildlife crime-related matters, and this has translated into about 150 allegations of crime. When you look at the added complexities of wildlife crime, not only do you have the associated criminality, and unfortunately, this is obviously leading globally to certain species becoming nearly extinct, and it has a real impact on the communities where they survive and rely upon these species and their existence. Within the team, we have a number of highly specialist detectives. Tara is one of our finest detectives, and back in 2018, she championed what was obviously a very unique case.
I've got 30 years' experience. I've worked in lots of different departments, both uniform and plain clothes, and I now work in the wonderful world of the Wildlife Crime Unit.
We work very closely with what are referred to as borough wildlife crime officers. So these are officers on the front line.
I work for a department within the RSPCA called the Special Operations Unit. is a plainclothes division of the inspectorate. We investigate organised animal crime. So that tends to be anything that is either financially driven or is gang related, such as dog fighting, badger digging, puppy dealing is a big area of our work, and in amongst that is the trading wild birds.
At the start of 2018, Operation Savannah was launched to investigate a gang behind the illegal trapping and selling of wild birds in the southeast of England.
The information was that this East London pub, the Bell in Leytonstone, was as regular as clockwork, so every weekend was having a bird club. This was an opportunity for men from roughly about the age of 18 to the age of 80, attending on a regular basis, meeting up there. There was even a poster that was put at the front door of the pub on a Saturday morning advertising Bird Club, £3. Someone's had to do that. They're making money on the door. Obviously not conducive for a pub to be open and running. This was a private affair that was arranged.
To trade a British bird in this country, it has to have a ring on its leg. So it has to be shown to be bred in captivity. What you can't do is catch a bird from the wild and then sell it. The most inhumane way that they will trap birds is called liming, the use of a non-setting glue. So things like rat glue, people can buy it for pest control. They'll smear this glue on things like floristry wire, so thin wires that are quite rigid, and then stick them in the ground surrounded by feed. And then they'll have a decoy bird in a separate cage, which then attracts the birds down. So when the birds land to feed, they get these wires stuck to their feathers, which stops them taking off. And then the trapper will come and just scoop the birds up.
Another common method to catch wild birds is to use a small wooden cage trap.
This is a standard single cage trap. You see it's wooden wire. You see this is the lid with a spring on it. This is the actual trap trigger. What they'll do is set that against the back of the trap, and that's the trap now set. As the birds come in and land on the trap, it gets triggered.
To attract the birds, seeds are placed next to a decoy bird, which is held in place with a hook.
You put the bird down, you tether it to another small post, and then the bird would attract other birds' attention by trying to fly away, but unable to, but yet still tethered to the ground.
The main injuries to the bird will be, once the bird's inside, what it'll do is it'll beat itself against these bars because it's under stress all the time. So you're going to be getting damage to the primary feathers as well as its head when it's trying to squeeze through the bars. Trying to develop intelligence around this area is a challenge because the people involved in this activity, they won't give us any information.
In 2018, the Metropolitan Police Wildlife Crime Unit established Operation Savannah to catch the criminals involved in the illicit trade of wild birds in the East End of London.
As the operation developed, we realised that we needed to expand it out away from the pub. At least 3 of the people attending we'd had previous prosecutions with.
Some of them that were named already had previous convictions in relation to animal cruelty, but mainly around offences relating to birds and the capture of wild birds. The additional evidence was allowing us to confirm who was actively involved, who we felt were the ringleaders, and make sure that the evidence was sufficient for a judge to grant us warrants for the pub and 3 other addresses.
But as the investigation got underway, more challenges appeared for the team.
The 3 addresses that were of interest to us, they were Essex area, so they were past our borders. So we also had the problems of making sure we had suitable support from other constabularies and making sure that our teams were able to deal suitably at those 3 addresses at the same time that we were entering the Bell pub.
We couldn't do one after the other because we couldn't afford for somebody to tip somebody off, the evidence being got rid of. We had to develop the information to make it actionable so that we knew when the optimum time was to strike at the pub, and that took a number of weeks. Where the pub was situated is on a really busy high street in London. You've got shops at the side of it, shops across the road, traffic on the road, people coming and going, extremely busy. But equally what we didn't know was how organised the event was. Did they have people outside watching to see if there was anybody on the street? Were they clocking any strangers coming in?
After meticulous planning, on the 2nd of February 2019, the Wildlife Crime Unit, together with the RSPCA and the Metropolitan Police, raided 4 addresses.
Fantastic day to do it. The Bell pub was absolutely heaving.
I can't say I've ever followed a police raid into a pub, which was unusual. You wouldn't expect this sort of activity to be happening in a pub. They were serving food, and you've got all these people walking past you with birds, just going into the beer garden. Police had gone in. Anybody who was holding a bird or stood near a bird moved away. And in some cases, throw the birds over the fence because they knew straight away that what they had in their possession was illegal and they didn't want to be seen near that bird.
I was receiving a phone call from one of my colleagues that was going to me, there is an aviary at my address that is full of goldfinches. And I kept saying, are you winding me up? Are you having a joke? This isn't funny. We're really, really busy here. No, I'm not. I'm really not. Are you sure? There is an aviary that's massive, that is chock-a-block full of wild captured goldfinches.
So mostly goldfinches. I've seen one exotic finch, which is up here in this top corner somewhere.
What you had in that location was someone who'd basically devoted their whole premises to the keeping and storing of birds. You know, it was an immense setup, and I've done many bird trapping jobs, but never on that scale.
You can see inside this bag, which was hanging on the window, that there is a single goldfinch. The bird is completely in darkness inside this bag. I believe this process is used to keep the birds calm, in my experience.
The money he'd spent on setting up the cages just shows how many birds were passing through his hands. He was trading birds on an industrial scale. That's not something that you would see regularly. He was one of the main players behind the pub.
DC Tara Wilson was facing another problem. Establishing who was a legitimate pub customer and who was there to illegally trade wild birds.
There were numerous cameras which recorded the actions of the day, but that camera had been running for weeks before, so the continuity was there for previous bird clubs. So, you know, none of them could say, oh, I actually just went there and looked that day and I wasn't too sure what it was about. Well, no, because you've actually been seen on this day and this day and this day.
The CCTV at the pub was significant to show that man A walked in that pub with a cage under his arm and he placed it on a table in the beer garden. He was then found stood 8 feet away from it by the police, and denied any knowledge of it. However, what we could show was that he walked in the pub with that cage under his arm, and that cage contained a wild goldfinch.
During the raids, more than 270 birds were seized from the 4 separate addresses. Inside the pub, the police found 40 cages containing goldfinches, linnets and siskins, as well as 27 canaries and mules. 190 wild birds were found at the home address in Southend-on-Sea.
I would love to do something like this again, although exhausting, very, very worthwhile. But the RSPCA said it was the biggest ever capture of wild British birds, and they were absolutely delighted at how well we worked together and the result on that day and subsequently, and the court results.
Operation Savannah prosecuted 17 people for various offences related to the keeping and possession of wild-caught birds. 3 offenders were disqualified from keeping birds for life, and the rest were fined. The mastermind behind the Bird Club was sentenced to 6 months in prison, suspended for 2 years. He was also ordered to pay £28,000 in costs.
It sends absolutely a clear message to these sort of people that their activities aren't tolerated. It's not acceptable. The public won't accept it, let alone the courts.
If you enjoyed watching how some of the most complex cases in the country are cracked, don't forget that Special Ops Crime Squad UK continues next Sunday at 7. And if you missed any previous episode, catch up now on UK TV Play. While next up it's time for QIXL.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.